Get Ripple, the bright new drink with that ring-a-ding flavor, Ripple.
All right, so for my Ripple podcast listener, we have a special guest tonight. It's my little brother and Angela's big brother, Eric. You may have heard us mention him before. Angela is taking some time off because she's super busy and has a real job. Say hello, Eric.
Hello.
Okay, I finally got him to speak. So I'm kind of going off of the tradition of pulling from the basket, and I picked a theme that I thought Eric would appreciate because it was like freaking pulling teeth, getting him to participate with me. I don't know why, because it's like the best thing ever to hang out with your sister. So I have a special present because I like to bribe people with presents. So let me get it. Did you see what I got for you? Have you ever had Buffalo Trace?
I don't think so.
So it's a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. And this is a good little pour. Where's my cup? I'll just drink out of the bottle. Try it. See what you think. Eric likes whiskey. He's a big whiskey drinker like Angela and I are too. What do you think?
It's all right. Not a big fan of whiskey neat.
Oh, you like it with an ice cube?
Yeah.
Oh, well, we can go get an ice cube. But this is Buffalo Trace. I'd never had Buffalo Trace before today. I think it's kind of sweet.
A little bit.
I like it. So you can sip on that while I tell you a story. What do you know about whiskey and bourbon, Eric? Do you know the difference of the two, or do you know what they're distilled with, or anything?
Not really.
Let me tell you a little bit about bourbon. So, like, to be called a bourbon, it needs to be a distilled grain that's aged in new oak barrels. So, and then at least half of the grain must be corn. So it's typically flavored with like barley or rye. But the story I'm going to tell you today is about a whiskey or a bourbon called Pappy Van Winkle, and not to be confused with Vanilla Ice, what's his real name? Robert Van Winkle?
Robert Matthew Van Winkle.
Robert Matthew Van Winkle. Yeah, Vanilla Ice. So, not of the same. But Pappy Van Winkle, or like Maker's Mark, they use wheat that gives the bourbon like a smoother taste with a, quote, seemingly endless and evolving cascade that introduces notes of cigar box, sweet tobacco, leather, and dried tangerine. Did you get any of that taste in your Buffalo Trace?
A little citrus.
Okay.
Maybe.
I know you have never gone wine tasting, but you're supposed to like take a drink and like aerate it in your mouth, and they do that weird like to get it like all the flavors meshing and stuff.
No.
I just drink it. Yeah. So a little history on good old Pappy Van Winkle. First of all, have you ever heard of Pappy Van Winkle before today?
It sounds familiar, but I don't know.
You don't know any, like, if I would have just said Pappy Van Winkle, would you have known it was a whiskey? Okay. You just would have been like, oh, maybe I've heard of that before.
Yeah, I think I've heard people bring it up before or mention it before in some sort of conversation.
Okay.
But no, I don't know anything about it.
So there's this really fancy whiskey called Pappy Van Winkle, and it actually started in 1893 by this guy named Julian, or as he was better known, Pappy Van Winkle, and he's passed it on to his son and grandson, and there's like Julian the third now, and it's, has lasted through time. It went through Prohibition, and everyone calls this bourbon the bourbon that everyone wants, but that no one can get. And there was this big thing that people are calling like a heist. There was this major stealing of these bottles and barrels of bourbon. So if you're thinking like a whiskey heist, what year would you think that would happen?
1930s.
Okay, that's what I thought too. You know, quite a while ago. This actually happened in 2013. So I'm going to tell you the story of Pappy Van Winkle and the Great Whiskey Heist. Bourbon, I think you and I have talked about before, and Angela, it doesn't really have to be distilled in Kentucky to be called bourbon, but 95% of it is. And Frankfurt, where this story takes place, it sits along like a string of distilleries, including like Woodford Reserve, Wild Turkey, and good old Buffalo Trace, what you're drinking right now. So it makes like 9 of the 10 most expensive bourbons, including Pappy Van Winkle. In 2002, to help keep up with the demand of just the desire of the bourbon, the Van Winkles contracted with Buffalo Trace to distill all 6 of their Pappy varieties. So there's a 10-year, a 12-year, a 15-year, a 20-year, and a 23-year-old version of Pappy Van Winkle. Plus, there's a rye whiskey, but the demand is still totally way more than they can supply because, you know, if you're selling a 23-year-old whiskey, obviously it takes 23 years.
Does it?
To age. There's, you know, people that actually live in the town can't even get their hands on this stuff. Bourbon, you know, it's got a kind of a little interesting history. It wasn't really necessarily like the most popular drink back in like the mid 70s, 80s. In 76, actually, vodka was America's #1 selling alcohol because there was like James Bond, you know, he made the martinis all popular, where whiskeys was kind of more of like a hillbilly backcountry folk were drinking it. And because of this, distilleries all over Kentucky were being shut down. Kentucky. Julian Van Winkle III, he took over the bourbon company in 1981. And they were selling such small amounts that he figured like, hey, I'm just going to put some in some barrels, get them out of the way, sell off what we have right now, and let's just see what happens, you know. It's going to sit here longer than the typical maybe 4 or 8 years. This is a little bit like if you ever want to brew your own brew your own bourbon. Is that what it's? Because you brew beer.
I think it's just make.
You make bourbon?
I believe so.
What do you do with wine? You
don't drink it.
Yeah, I drink it. So
ferment wine.
You ferment wine. You're right. I think you age bourbon.
Yeah.
Okay. As bourbon ages, it loses liquor evaporation. And distillers, they actually call that the angel's share. Like the angels come down and they take little sips as they're, you know, tasting your bourbon and as it's aging. So when a barrel of Pappy is aged for 20 years or more, the angel's share of a 55-gallon barrel of whiskey is about how much you would think? Guess how many gallons?
More than one?
Well, yeah, more than one. So
there's
a 55-gallon barrel of bourbon. It's sitting there for 20 years.
Yeah, but it's not like open to the elements. It's sealed up.
It's sealed, but it's wood.
Yeah.
So alcohol evaporates.
With oxygen.
Right.
And it's in an airtight container.
It's not airtight.
5?
Okay, sure. 5. You would be so wrong. Because after 20 years, about 50 gallons of alcohol have evaporated. So leaves only about 5 gallons of bourbon after sitting there for 2 decades. So Buffalo Trace only produces around 7,000 to 8,000 cases of their bourbon a year. This is about 1,000th of the amount that Jim Beam produces. So it's a little teeny amount. So 20 years after that whiskey had been like sitting around in the barrels, good old Julian comes and he opens them and he sends some of it off to the Beverage Tasting Institute where they rate whiskey. And it was rated at a 99, which is the highest score ever given to a bourbon. That in itself kind of got people excited about this bourbon, but it even goes more than that. So this guy, Toby, he starts working at the Buffalo Trace Distillery in 1988. He works in the warehouse. He is just graduated high school, and he's making $7.51 an hour, which is pretty good. I know when I got my first job, it was 1997, I believe, and I was making $6.36, and that was above minimum wage. So he's working in 1988, making $7.51, and he's in Kentucky, where their minimum wage is a lot lower than California's. Toby moves up in the company, and he gets moved to the shipping department and then to the processing department. So he's working hard. He's moving up. Toby's an avid hunter. He was super passionate about lobbying against firearm restrictions. And since the town that he was living in was really small and there wasn't a whole lot to do, softball was like a major event. And Toby played on a softball team with some of his best friends. So beer and softball, they, kind of go hand in hand. And then Toby starts kind of bringing in some bourbon to kind of liven up the games even more so. They start switching out their bottles full of Gatorade for bourbon. So, kind of sounds like a fun time to me. It would get me out on the softball field. So Toby's job at Buffalo Trace was really good. He enjoyed it. He had a lot of good friends where he was working with. And distillery jobs are very desirable, and depending on what your job title is, employees can make an average of $90,000 a year. Toby did work really hard. He often worked 7 days a week, 10 hours a day to get that much, but he was now married to this girl named Julie, and he's got 2 kids, and like I said, he loved going to work. He had all of his best friends with him, and it was just, a good place to work where they had fun together. So working at the distillery, according to Toby, taking a bottle of whiskey every once in a while was just something that happened. It was almost like a perk of the job. And I know, I've walked home with pens or markers and stuff from jobs before. And I think a lot of people, have used their friends' discounts if they work at a store to get them a deal. I think not necessarily the most honest thing, but I think it's something that is commonly done. So now it's 20 years later, and Toby's still working at Buffalo Trace, and he now has the position of senior on the loading dock. Life's going good. Bourbon prices were at a high, and they were aging more bourbon, prepping it to sell more than they had since the 1970s. So bourbon's getting more popular again. The company's doing great.
What year was this?
Around 2008.
All right.
So Toby invites this guy to come over and hang out at his house after work, and he pulls out, a bottle of Van Winkle for the 2 of them to enjoy. His friend picks up the bottle, and he's like, "Oh, wow. Hey, can you get me a bottle of this for my buddy? He would totally like it." And Toby supposedly at first is like, I don't really want to get all mixed up in that, stealing and selling bottles from work. Julie is like super overwhelmed. She's working full time doing real estate, and she drives the kids around. Toby actually had to quit softball to help out at the house more. And he'd just been really feeling like stuck in a rut. So he's like, "Hey, I don't need any more stress in my life. Just here, I've got 2 bottles for you. Take them, and that's good." And so
how much is a bottle worth?
At that time,
yeah,
retail was probably around $75.
In 2008. Not that much then.
No, not that much. So the next day, that same friend comes over again, and he drops a wad of cash full of $100 bills on Toby's counter. And along with that money, he gives Toby a phone number, and he's like, hey, call this person. He'll buy anything you can get. So Toby's like, oh, you know what? I just made a ton of cash right now. It kind of gave him that like little high that softball had been giving him. That kind of excitement that he hadn't been getting for a while because he was just stuck in that rut. So Toby did a little Googling, and he found that 20-year-old bottles of Pappy were going for over $1,000 on like the black market. Like I said before, those bottles were originally sold for like $50 to $75, depending on the year. So why were these bottles so expensive if they were just selling for that smaller amount? It's because of the small batches, but also because they had just all of a sudden blown up in popularity. Do you know who Anthony Bourdain is? He's like this Food Network guy. He's got a huge following. He was shown drinking Pappy and like tweeting about it and said it was just like the most amazing thing ever. And since he's like a foodie, like he's got, supposedly like the, amazing taste buds, he knows what's good. But then there's also pictures of like NFL stars, like just like chugging out of a bottle of Pappy after they win a game. There's even like the Pope that is drinking Pappy, and he's like, oh, this is very good bourbon. So it's getting more and more popular, especially with social media. So, and even though it was from Frankfort, Kentucky, the locals couldn't even get their hands on a bottle. They had started a lottery system. So to me, it kind of looked like a Black Friday sale where you see people just like lined up around the corner to get a $99 TV. So they're wrapped around this giant building, and they're just waiting in line to receive a number that can possibly get them a bottle of Pappy. And these are the locals that can't even get it. But Toby, being the mastermind that he was, figured out that he could make a few bottles of Pappy, disappear here and there. And with a couple of small sales, he would make the same amount as he'd get in 2 paychecks. So as word gets out that Toby could get his hands on the desirable Pappy, his customer base starts to increase, which means he needs more supply. So originally he had just started taking bottles from a display case, or they had like this big locked cage in the distillery where they'd like put all the bottles and stuff, but they didn't have a whole lot of security, not a good security system. And the cage where all the Pappy was stored, it actually had a broken door on it, so the hinges could be slipped and just removed. So you didn't even really need a key. And also, the inventory was only done when the bourbon was placed in the cage and not again until it was taken out to be sold. So their inventory check and balances weren't really that active. So it wasn't noticed that bottles were missing until a lot later. He starts talking to some of his friends that he worked with and asked them if they could start, grabbing a bottle here and there and bring it back to Toby, and then he would give them a cut from the buyers. And people start asking for different kinds of rare bourbon too. Eagle Rare 10-year, Blanton's. I am not a huge fancy whiskey bourbon drinker. I know the Jack Daniels and Maker's Mark type stuff. So a lot of these I hadn't heard of before, but apparently a lot of these are pretty fancy. And by this time, Toby is getting pretty well known as being able to get stuff for people that the average person isn't able to get their hands on. And the people that help him, they're making money as well. Toby's showing up at kind of underground poker games that people are having, where there's attorneys and judges and chief of police, fancy people, or not fancy, but important people, high-ranking people are, and he's, bringing bottles of Pappy for them to enjoy at their poker games. So one night, this guy that worked with Toby at Buffalo Trace, he drives over to Toby's house and he's super high on, I don't know, coke, crank, something. He's sniffing something. And he drives one of the maintenance trucks from Buffalo Trace, and it's loaded down with over 80 cases of alcohol. So much that it like practically is bottoming out. At first, Toby's super pissed off that his buddy had stolen so much and brings it to his house. But he found it was very easy to actually get rid of that much. And so he's like, oh, all right, I can totally do this. I am going to just start stealing and selling alcohol. So he's really getting a plan together. And he calls up some of his softball buddies to help him get more alcohol, including this guy named Sean Searcy, who worked over at Wild Turkey, which is just down the way. And Sean was known for not only getting like bottles of Wild Turkey, he'd get entire barrels of Wild Turkey over to Toby's house. So Sean he had the ability to get into all 18 of Wild Turkey's rick houses. That's where they do the aging in the rick houses. And in those rick houses, they had over more than 500,000 barrels that were just sitting around aging. And it was Sean's job from Wild Turkey, not from Toby, but Sean's like real paying job, was to load his 18-wheeler with barrels from the distillery and take them to the warehouse that was like 30 miles away, I guess, to age. And then once the barrels were in the warehouse, they just sat there for however many years, and they're pretty much forgotten about until they are supposed to be taken out and bottled. And so once the barrels are in a warehouse, no one sees them again. And Sean's aware of this. So he's able to maybe put the barrels in there and then take them out of a different warehouse, and no one knows.
Until they go to
barrel it. But that could be, 4, 5, 6 years later. So eventually Toby's getting more and more bold. He would actually like take forklifts from the Buffalo Trace distillery full of bottles that were just, pallets full of bottles, and just load the pallets right onto his truck. And then he allegedly filled 55-gallon barrels with Eagle Rare, and he'd just let them sit for a couple days in the warehouse. And then he'd slap some stickers on them that I guess the company would use to mark, maybe they had gotten, somehow, not infested isn't the right word, but somehow gotten damaged, so they weren't good to sell. And so he'd put these little stickers on them that are supposed to get taken out and destroyed, and then he would just instead load them into his truck. And people, they're just, constantly texting Toby with, I need 8 bottles, I need 12 bottles, I need a barrel, and he's getting money. This one guy even writes him a check that puts softball hitting lessons in the memo, but it was obviously not for softball. So Toby told most people that he sold the bourbon too, that they were buying legitimate bottles. He told them it was excess inventory or seconds, and that it couldn't be maybe bottled and sold normally and had to be thrown away. And he often made deliveries to his customers wearing his green Buffalo Trace work shirt. So twice he loaded several stainless steel barrels used to hold whiskey that's done aging but not ready for bottling, the process, into the back of his truck, and he just drives right past the security guard, and come to find out later that the security guard was paid off as well. So there's a lot of people working for or with Toby. So I didn't mention earlier, but about the whole base or softball team that he was on and loved and had all these buddies with. Well, apparently they're all doing steroids as well, to get bigger and hit the balls faster. And this, even though Toby's not playing softball as much, he's still doing his steroids. And apparently steroids are known to make people a little angry. So he'd often yell at other workers for doing something that he had just asked them to. And one time he totally goes off on this coworker for moving a barrel to a correct location. But Toby had moved it to the wrong place to make it easier for him to load into the truck. So this guy's trying to do his job. He moves a barrel over here. Toby's like, what the hell? Like, why did you move this barrel? And the guy's like, dude, this is where the barrel's supposed to be. But in Toby's mind, he had put it over, probably towards the door to make it easier to get out of. So Toby's just super angry a lot of the time now. But the steroids seem to make the work a little bit easier because Sean, he's the one getting the barrels from Wild Turkey. And so Toby's the main salesman, but Sean's getting these big, big barrels. And he's loading these barrels in and out of his truck. They're like 500-pound barrels. And he would do it by himself with just the use of like an aluminum ladder as a ramp. So he's, rolling up these barrels and rolling out these barrels. And according to a text message that he sent to his girlfriend, it said, quote, I have taken a lot of steroids that's for animals. And so these steroids that they're getting obviously are illegal, but they're getting, some from like Tractor Supply store, and they're, kind of getting their hands on whatever they can and just injecting them. And this other guy that is part of their little Bourbon Heist team is this guy named Mike Wells, and he is a police officer. So they've kind of got, he was on the base or softball team with Toby and Sean, and he's doing the steroids. He's helping make the bourbon sales, and he's also the police department's official dare officer. So I thought that was kind of funny, kind of ironic. This other time, Toby, he takes a hose out of a coworker's tank of alcohol, like she's filling up a tank, and he just grabs it and he lets it pour out all over the floor, pretty much just to get her in trouble because he's angry at her for something that she did. And so he's being this like total punk, and people would be going like, okay, well, why are they putting up with him? Why don't they like say something, or why are they, so kind of like not worshiping, but kind of like bowing down to him in a way. And I guess people were also afraid of him because he had a silenced .22 that he would carry and then fire in the parking lot of the Buffalo Trace into a dirt pile. And I guess he did it where a lot of people were, and they thought it was kind of intimidating. Not that he was going to shoot anyone, but I don't know. I guess that kind of made people a little nervous. Maybe he'd get angry and go off and shoot one of them or something. So Sean now has been doing this for a while, getting these barrels from Wild Turkey, and he's starting to get a little stressed out. He's working 2 jobs himself. He's taking care of his sick and dying dad, and then, he's stealing barrels and barrels of bourbon. So he finally tells Toby that he was done, and he didn't want these barrels at his house anymore. He was worried that his ex was going to, report him. She's super angry at him. And Toby's like, okay, fine. Let's get him over to my house. And they put him in Toby's yard. And, we'll just wait and sell them off, and you don't have to have them at your house anymore. So in October of 2013, there's this girl, and she's doing inventory in the big cage at Buffalo Trace, and she notices that some of the Pappy Van Winkle is missing. And there's actually 65 3-bottle cases of the Pappy Van Winkle 20-year and 9 3 cases of the 13-year-old Van Winkle Family Reserve Rye. So she's like, oh, wow, this is not okay. This is kind of a lot. And she doesn't really go to her supervisors or anyone. She actually goes right to the phone and calls the authorities. And she's like, hey, we have a theft here. And she makes a report. So all in all, there were over 200 bottles of Pappy missing at that time. And that was in October. And then a couple months later, early December, Pat Melton, was the sheriff of Franklin County, Kentucky. He announces that there's a $10,000 reward to anyone that could give information that leads to a conviction in the case. So it's been made public now that there's, been a big theft in the bourbon industry. And if anyone has any info, there's a reward. And $1,000 of that reward was offered by Bluegrass Crime Stoppers. And then the other $9,000 was from an anonymous donor. So later on, some people kind of thought, oh, maybe the other $9,000 was actually from Buffalo Trace. Maybe it was a publicity, like, hey, $10,000 thing. That was never told. So in March of 2015, and so, 2 years after this missing bourbon happens, an anonymous tip came through to the Franklin County Sheriff's Office in Kentucky that said that, hey, you should go look in the back of Toby's house. I'm pretty sure you're going to find some of your missing whiskey there. So the police show up to the property. And I guess they drive up, and as soon as they get out of their cars, they can smell just bourbon in the air. And the deputies spent hours searching the house and ransacking the home and the yard. And they find 11 handguns, 5 rifles, 3 shotguns, a silencer, a half dozen types of steroids, various drugs for erectile dysfunction, and a plastic bag of hypodermic needles, along with the whiskey. And it sounds like, I feel like a lot of the sources I read and even the Netflix documentary that I watched, they a little bit played up the guns, 11 handguns and 5 rifles, blah, blah, blah. But it did later say that all of the guns that Toby had, he had registered for. So it's not like he was dealing guns as well. He just liked guns.
There's not that many guns.
Yeah, it's fine. So be it. So Toby was scared, and he's like, crap. And he's sitting out on his porch, and he starts texting his buddies to let them know what's going on. And hey, hide any evidence of the stolen goods that you might have. Apparently, he didn't think that there was going to be a text trail, because when the police take his phone from him, he goes oh, if you see any, text messages regarding Pappy, just totally ignore those. Don't even bother reading those text messages. So the authorities, they did find those 5 barrels at Toby's house, and they were confirmed to be from the Wild Turkey Distillery.
So he just was sitting on them for 2 years.
I think they were still, not 2 years. I think he's still getting barrels and bottles and stuff.
Oh, I thought it was the original or the.
Oh, not those. No. The Wild Turkey barrels had spray painted black to cover up any of the labels, but they were actually Wild Turkey. So all in all, there were 10 people, including Toby's wife, Julie, that were indicted on various charges, and Toby was considered the ringleader. So in September of 2017, Toby pleads guilty to engaging in organized crime, receiving stolen property, and some, other little charges. Many of the people that were involved in this heist, they took plea agreements offered by the prosecution. So what they did, they're coming to try to figure out who did what, who's in charge, who's been stealing, and they offer immunity to anyone that would give them some information. So Toby is the only one that serves jail time. So Sean didn't serve any jail time. Their buddy Mike, the police officer, didn't serve any jail time. Julie didn't serve any jail time. Toby gets sentenced to 15 years in prison. And the authorities mention that, like, they estimated that the value of the stolen liquor was probably around $100,000. Mike Wells, the police officer, he ends up resigning from the police department.
So, wait, $100,000 over 4 years, and he gets 15 years in prison?
Mm-hmm.
That seems, I mean...
Like harsh?
It was a harsh punishment.
Well.
And, like, he really didn't make any money.
Oh, he made a lot of money.
$100,000 over 4 years, and he had to split it up with all of his buddies. That's less than $25,000 a year.
He made way more than $100,000. Way more. He's selling these bottles for way more than market value. He's selling some of them for $1,000 each. So he's making bank. He actually, like, bought a new house. He took his family to Disneyland. Big extravagant Christmas gifts. No, he's spending a lot of money. He was having a good life. He probably, the amount he stole from Buffalo Trace was $100,000, but that's not how much he made by selling those goods. So in June of 2018, a judge agreed for Toby to be let out of prison after 30 days. And he just, got probation. He wasn't able to own, I think, guns for 2 years.
But guns had nothing to do with it.
Nothing to do with it. But I think if you're on probation, you can't have guns.
Maybe.
I don't know. I've never been on probation. So since Toby was a first-time offender and the crime he committed was a non-violent one, the prosecutors and the judge agreed that his sentence should be shortened. The prosecutor said in court, quote, "Simply put, throughout this state, there are too many repeat offenders, heroin and fentanyl traffickers, burglars, robbers, murderers, and sex offenders who are much more deserving of this defendant's prison cot." I kind of liked that.
Yeah.
So Toby's parole supervision is set to end in 2023. And since, all of this happened, Toby obviously lost his job at the distillery. And according to his lawyer, Toby has taken up painting houses as a way to support his wife and 2 kids. And his wife, Julie, who I mentioned before, she is the competitive CrossFitter. She owns a gym, like a CrossFit gym in town. And she took a plea and just pled to possession of drug paraphernalia and possession of a controlled substance.
With the steroids?
The steroids. Mm-hmm. She did what's called an Alford plea, which means that she didn't admit to guilt, but conceded that there was enough evidence to convict her, which, again, I had never heard of an Alford plea before. So she's able to avoid jail time. She's still now working at a realtor called Plum Tree Realty, and she still lives in Frankfurt with Toby. And she's also doing her certified personal trainer stuff. And I found her on Facebook.
You add her as a friend?
I did not add her as a friend. I just did a little Facebook stalking of her. And she was like super pumped about this whole Heist show on Netflix. She was like, oh, 3 more days and our show comes out. So she's kind of embraced the whole, like, kind of queen of the Bourbon Heist world and was definitely getting attention from it. We do the ripples at the end of our stories. I don't know if you've ever listened to our podcast before, Eric.
No.
But okay, so our the name of the podcast is The Ripple.
Yeah, it's like cheap wine.
It is a cheap wine.
They don't even make it anymore?
They don't make it anymore. But we also like to tell what happened after the story. That's The Ripple.
And she's a CrossFitter.
Well, there's a little bit more. So all of the stolen bourbon that was returned or recovered is headed for death row.
Yeah, they can't resell
They
it.
can't. And they're going to pretty much take a bulldozer to it and plow it into the ground and put it in the hazmat landfill. And it just kind of makes me sad. One of the barrels, just an empty barrel of Pappy, was found in someone's yard, like just as like, yard art.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently, if it had been full, it could have been sold at the time, like at the black market, for $100,000. So there were some people that turned their bottles into the police.
Dummies.
Yeah. One guy like burned his barrel. Another one supposedly poured their bottles down the sink. And there was like one attorney that said, "Oh, don't go light a match near the Kentucky River. It might light up on fire," because of all the people supposedly dumping their whiskey. I find that very, very hard to believe.
Yeah.
So spending to like $1,500 to $4,000 on a bottle on the secondary market wasn't, or still isn't, uncommon. Currently, the retail price is like $129.99 for a 20-year and $249.99 for a 23-year bottle of Pappy.
But you can't get it.
So
how do you get it?
You have to go get in line for the lottery.
What if you live in a different state?
And then you have to know somebody that lives in Kentucky that can go stand in line in the lottery for you.
Can Tobin stand in line?
Huh?
Can Toby stand in line, or whatever his name is?
No, I don't know if he's allowed on the property anymore. I did look up bottles of Pappy online to see what I could find. I found quite a few, actually, that you could buy on eBay. But they're empty bottles of Pappy for $350. So I'm thinking what people are doing are buying these empty bottles and refilling them with some cheaper whiskey. And then when they have friends come over, they're like, "Oh, here, you're one of my good friends. Have some of my, $100 a shot glass of whiskey here."
I could see you doing something like that.
No. So Sazerac, which is the parent company of Buffalo Trace, they're supposedly spending $70 million on security and like a more automated warehouse to take care of stuff. So I do have friends. I was talking to them, telling them that I was going to do this story, and some of them had never heard of Pappy Van Winkle. Some had, and some had actually had Pappy Van Winkle before. And I guess they bought a bottle, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, how much did you pay for it?" This is in 2013 or 2012. And they said that they paid $65 for a bottle, and I was like, "Oh, really?" And I was talking to the husband, and he's like, "Oh yeah, but it wasn't Pappy Van Winkle." So Pappy Van Winkle has Old Rip Van Winkle, which is like a straight bourbon that's aged for 10 years. And then they have Van Winkle Special Reserve Lot B, which is aged 12 years. And then they have the Van Winkle Family Reserve, which is just a straight rye whiskey, which is aged for 13 years. So they had the Old Rip Van Winkle, which is just a 10-year bottle, which is more common to get. They did say it was amazing and delicious. But apparently, if you ever go to like a nicer restaurant and you do see, Pappy on the menu, you should either ask to see the bottle or ask how many years it's been aged to see if it's actually Pappy, or they're trying to kind of pawn it off as Pappy and it's maybe Old Rip Van Winkle or one of the Van Winkle specials, which is like, ooh, that's kind of sneaky. So I think we should go find a place that has it, and I think we should try it.
Yeah.
So that is the end of my story. So thank you for staying awake and listening to it. And you can now finish your Buffalo Trace.
All right.
All right. Hopefully next week Angela will be back, and maybe we'll get another headphone and another mic so Eric can join us as well. And at the end of every episode, Eric, we say something, and it goes like this. I'm going to say, don't forget to be a fountain, and you have to say, not a drain. Okay, that's your line. Not a drain. Got it? Ready? Don't forget to be a fountain.
I don't get it.
Don't forget to be a fountain.
I don't understand what you want.
Don't forget to be a fountain.
You're a fountain?
And not a drain. Bye.